The lunchtime rush at Maplewood Food Court was in full swing. The smell of grilled burgers, sizzling fries, and fresh coffee filled the air as workers on break, families, and tourists crowded into the space, each wrapped in their own world. The sound of conversation and clattering trays created a steady hum that almost drowned out the brewing tension. At a quiet corner of the food court, Daniel Carter, a 65-year-old retired Army veteran, stood patiently in line at Frank's Deli, waiting to order. He wore a worn-out military jacket, one he had owned for years, the fabric frayed at the edges, the insignia barely visible. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and his posture, though relaxed, carried the kind of discipline that never truly faded from a soldier. Behind him, Tyler Mason, a cocky, well-dressed businessman in his mid-30s, stood with his arms crossed, his foot tapping impatiently. His expensive watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his fitted blazer screaming money and self-importance. He wasn't used to waiting, and he certainly wasn't used to people like Daniel being in his way. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. With an exaggerated sigh, Tyler muttered to his friend, just loud enough for others to hear, "Jesus, some people take forever. What, is he deciding if he can afford it?" Daniel didn't react. Tyler smirked, encouraged by the lack of response. He raised his voice slightly, making sure more people heard him. Or maybe he's waiting for a military discount. You know how these old guys love their handouts. A few heads turned. A couple of people shifted uncomfortably. The cashier at Frank's Deli, a young woman named Samantha, frowned as she glanced toward Daniel, but the veteran still didn't say a word. That annoyed Tyler. Nothing pissed him off more than being ignored. So he stepped closer, invading Daniel's space. "Hey buddy, you gonna order today or wait until next week?" Daniel finally moved. He slowly turned his head, his calm gray-blue eyes locking onto Tyler's. There was no anger, no hostility, just a quiet, unreadable intensity. "You in a hurry, son?" Daniel asked, his voice smooth and steady. Tyler chuckled, shaking his head. "I just don't have all day to wait for some old-timer to count his pennies." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than Tyler had expected. The food court wasn't as loud anymore. People were paying attention now. And yet, Daniel still didn't react the way Tyler wanted. No anger, no offense, no frustration, just a small, quiet chuckle. Then he turned back toward the counter and spoke to the cashier. "Turkey sandwich on rye, extra mustard." The ease in Daniel's voice bothered Tyler more than anything. He wanted a reaction, wanted the old man to snap, to argue, to give him a reason to keep pushing. But Daniel was unshakable, and that made Tyler want to break him even more. With a smirk, Tyler reached forward and flicked the patch on Daniel's sleeve. "Bet you wear this jacket hoping someone will say, 'Thank you for your service,' huh?" Daniel's hand paused mid-reach toward his wallet. The air around them shifted. The cashier froze. The other customers in line stiffened. Even Tyler's friend stepped back slightly, sensing that the temperature in the room had just dropped. Slowly, deliberately, Daniel set his wallet down on the counter. Then, with measured precision, he turned to fully face Tyler. For the first time since this started, Tyler felt it, that shift in energy. The quiet, controlled presence of a man who had seen more, done more, survived more than Tyler could ever understand. And suddenly, Tyler's bravado didn't feel as solid anymore. "You done, son?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. The smirk on Tyler's face faltered, just slightly. Because in that moment, he finally realized something. He had just made a very big mistake. The silence in the food court stretched long and heavy. People were no longer just passively observing. They were watching, waiting. Even the hum of conversation from nearby tables had faded, replaced by the kind of tension that made the air thicker, heavier. Tyler Mason felt it. He wasn't sure why, but something about the way Daniel Carter was looking at him made his stomach tighten. The veteran's expression hadn't changed. There was no anger, no raised voice, no clenched fists. And yet, Tyler felt trapped. Something primal inside him whispered, "You just picked the wrong man." But his ego wouldn't let him back down, not in front of everyone. So, he forced a smirk, crossing his arms. "What? You gonna lecture me about respecting my elders now?" Daniel didn't take the bait. He didn't roll his shoulders, didn't puff up his chest, didn't even blink. He just stood there, still and calm, the kind of calm that makes people nervous. "You ever been in a real fight, son?" Daniel asked, his voice smooth as steel. Tyler let out a short, arrogant laugh, but the sound felt hollow even to him. "Oh, please, I've been in plenty of fights." Daniel nodded, just once, slow and deliberate. "Yeah, I figured." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Daniel said, tilting his head slightly, "you've never fought anyone who actually knew what they were doing." The confidence in Tyler's stance wavered, just slightly. Daniel took a step closer, not aggressive, not fast, just deliberate. His movements were the kind that didn't waste energy, the kind that came from years of knowing exactly what he was capable of. "I spent 3 tours overseas," Daniel continued, his voice lowering just enough that only Tyler could hear it. "I've had men try to kill me. I've watched friends bleed out in places you've never heard of. I've walked into rooms knowing there was a chance I wouldn't walk out again." Tyler tried to swallow, but his mouth felt dry. Daniel kept going, his voice never rising, never breaking. "So, forgive me if I don't find you particularly intimidating." A few of the customers nearby exchanged looks, sensing the energy in the room shift even further. The cashier, Samantha, stood frozen, her eyes flicking nervously between the two men. Tyler's smirk was completely gone now. He forced a chuckle, taking a step back. "All right, man, relax. I was just messing around." Daniel nodded again, that same slow, knowing nod. "Yeah, I figured that too." There was no gloating in his voice, no anger, just a statement of fact. And somehow, that was so much worse. Tyler's fingers twitched at his sides. He wanted to say something, anything to take back control of the situation, but the words wouldn't come. Daniel let the silence stretch, let Tyler sit in the weight of his own foolishness. Then, finally, he turned back to the cashier. "Turkey sandwich on rye," he repeated, his voice smooth, as if nothing had happened. Samantha snapped out of her trance, nodding quickly. Right, coming right up." Tyler felt the burn of humiliation creeping up his neck. He could feel the eyes on him, the people in line, the customers at the tables, his own friend who had suddenly gone quiet. He had walked into this, expecting to make fun of some old man. Instead, he had just been put in his place. And the worst part, Daniel hadn't even needed to raise his voice to do it. Tyler Mason had never been in a situation where he wasn't in control. He was used to winning arguments, used to having the last word, used to being the loudest voice in the room. But right now, standing in a food court with dozens of eyes burning into him, he had never felt so small. Daniel Carter turned back toward the counter, giving Samantha, the cashier, a small nod as she rushed to get his order. He didn't look at Tyler anymore, didn't acknowledge him, and somehow, that was worse than being yelled at. Tyler's breath was shallow, his hands clenching at his sides. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He needed to salvage this, turn it around, say something, anything, that would make him feel like he was still in control. He forced a laugh, too loud, too forced. "Oh, come on. Everyone's acting like this guy is some kind of legend." He gestured toward Daniel, who still wasn't looking at him. "I mean, he's just some old guy who got lucky enough to survive a war. What's the big deal?" The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he had gone too far. The food court had already been quiet, but now, it felt dead. A woman sitting with her husband turned and glared at Tyler, shaking her head. A man in a flannel jacket, someone who had been watching quietly, let out a sharp breath and muttered, "You're dumber than I thought." Even his own friend, who had been laughing with him just minutes ago, muttered, "Dude, shut up." Tyler's stomach twisted. Daniel exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, before finally turning his head back toward Tyler. His eyes, calm but piercing, locked onto him once more. "Son," Daniel said quietly, his voice low and measured, "let me explain something to you." Tyler's throat felt dry. He wanted to move, to step back, but something about the way Daniel spoke kept him rooted in place. "You think being in a war is about luck?" Daniel asked, tilting his head slightly. "You think standing in front of men who want to kill you, hearing bullets crack past your head, watching people you care about die beside you, you think that's luck?" Tyler opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel stepped closer, his presence heavy, commanding, unshakable. "You ever been in a real fight?" Daniel asked again, the same question from before, but this time there was something colder in his voice. Tyler swallowed. "You ever had to hold your best friend's hand while he bled out, knowing there wasn't a damn thing you could do to save him?" Daniel's voice was steady, controlled, but the intensity was suffocating. Tyler looked away. "You ever hear the sound a man makes when he takes his last breath?" Daniel continued. "You ever had to tell his wife why he isn't coming home?" Tyler couldn't breathe. Daniel took another step forward, forcing Tyler to meet his eyes. "You ever carried the weight of knowing you survived and someone else didn't?" Tyler's face burned. He felt exposed, stripped down to nothing. "You ever live with ghosts, son?" Daniel's voice softened, just slightly, but the weight of his words hit like a hammer. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest. Daniel exhaled, then shook his head. Number didn't think so. For the first time, Tyler felt something he had never truly felt before. Shame. Real, heavy, suffocating shame. He had spent his whole life looking down on people, mocking them, treating them like they were beneath him. But now he was face to face with a man who had lived through more than Tyler could ever comprehend. And the worst part, everyone had seen him get put in his place. The cashier, Samantha, slid Daniel's sandwich across the counter, her lips pressed in a thin line as she avoided looking at Tyler altogether. "Here you go, sir." Daniel took his tray and turned away from Tyler without another word. He didn't need to say anything else, because he had already won. Tyler felt his pulse in his ears. He glanced around the food court, expecting someone, anyone, to be on his side. But no one was. They had all seen the truth, and so had he. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." Without another word, Tyler turned and walked away. Because he couldn't stand to be in that room for another second. Tyler Mason pushed through the food court doors, the cool afternoon air hitting his face like a slap. He kept walking fast, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, his hands shaking at his sides. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get out of there. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of traffic. Every step felt heavier, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He had never felt this before. Not once in his life had he been made to feel so small. He had spent years talking down to people, mocking them, making them feel lesser. It was easy. He had the money, the confidence, the sharp tongue. He was always in control. But back in that food court, he had been nothing. Not because Daniel Carter had yelled, not because he had threatened him, but because he hadn't needed to. Tyler clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He wanted to blame the old man, wanted to tell himself that the guy was just some washed-up veteran trying to feel important. But deep down, he knew the truth. Daniel Carter wasn't a man who needed respect. He had already earned it long before Tyler had ever opened his mouth. And Tyler, he was just another loud voice in a world full of them. But he had nothing to back it up. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, exhaling sharply. His reflection in a storefront window caught his attention. He looked at himself, his expensive clothes, his tailored jacket, his perfect haircut. None of it mattered. Not when a single stare from an old man had unraveled him completely. Behind him, the food court doors swung open. Jason, his friend, stepped out, shoving his hands into his pockets as he approached. "Dude," Jason muttered, shaking his head. "What the hell was that?" Tyler let out a dry laugh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, man," Jason scoffed. "No, I mean, what were you thinking, going after that guy? You had no idea who you were messing with." Tyler didn't respond. Jason sighed, tilting his head toward the food court. "That guy? I looked him up while you were getting your ass handed to you with words. James Jim Carter, retired Army sergeant, 3 tours overseas, Bronze Star, Silver Star." Tyler's stomach twisted. Jason let out a short laugh. "You realize what that means, right? A Silver Star? That's one of the highest military honors you can get. That means he saved lives. That means he did some serious shit. And you stood there mocking him like he was some nobody." Tyler swallowed hard. He hadn't even known what a Silver Star was before today. He had never cared about what guys like Daniel had done. but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. Jason shook his head. Look, man, I get that you like to push buttons, but today, you picked the wrong guy and everyone saw it. Tyler exhaled sharply, looking away. He wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but there was nothing to say. Jason patted him on the shoulder before turning to walk away. Think about that, man. Maybe next time, keep your mouth shut. Tyler stood there, watching as his friend disappeared into the crowd, leaving him alone with the cold, hard truth. For the first time in his life, Tyler wasn't angry that he had lost. He was ashamed that he had never truly understood what men like Daniel had sacrificed. Inside the food court, Daniel Carter sat at a small table by the window, calmly eating his sandwich. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was a glint in his eyes that said he had seen this before. Men like Tyler came and went. Some learned, some didn't. Daniel didn't care either way, because at the end of the day, he had already fought the battles that mattered. And Tyler, he had just learned a lesson he would never forget. The end